Natural disasters are not targeted attacks. Hurricanes and tornadoes and winter storms don't ask about race or class before they destroy property, personal belongings, and end lives. Why is it then that the people who seem to end up the most affected by these tragedies share so many traits? Almost 50 hurricanes have made landfall in the United States in the 21st century, with 16 of them having major effects being at or above a Category 3. Since 1980, 403 weather and climate disasters have hit the U.S., causing approximately $2,915 billion in damage. The fact is that during these natural disasters, minorities, the elderly, and lower income communities are more likely to experience harsher impacts than any other groups. This is not a coincidence, as there are many common traits shared by these groups that make them more vulnerable during these events. Natural disasters have a much greater effect on minority, elderly, and lower income communities, as they are more likely to live in areas prone to natural disasters due to historical redlining, and they are more likely to have difficulties preparing for and recovering from natural disasters. Redlining is a 20th century segregation practice that divided neighborhoods into four ratings: A, B, C, and D. A and B were the most desirable and did not have any minority groups, while C and D housed all of the Black, Asian, and Jewish neighborhoods. These are yellow and red zones. This segregation was aimed at giving those who live in C and D neighborhoods unfair credit and mortgage loan offers to deter them from moving and keep them in the same neighborhoods, therefore maintaining the segregation. While redlining may be a thing of the past, its effects are still visible in the present. Redfin conducted a study in which they found that there is a higher risk of flood damage for areas that were previously redlined than those that were not. This is extremely important in terms of inequality when you consider that almost 60% of these previously redlined areas remain non-white. Historically redlined areas were more likely to be flood zones in most regions apart from Florida. This means that whenever flooding occurs in these regions, the people most affected will be living within historically red zoned areas, which are in the majority people of color. With the number of hurricanes that have hit the U.S. in the 21st century, there is an abundance of data to be considered when it comes to if these claims are factual. For example, 7 of the zip codes that received the most flood damage in Hurricane Katrina, which hit New Orleans, Louisiana in 2005, were at least 75% Black. For Hurricane Harvey, which hit Houston in 2017, the most damage occurred in an area of Houston where almost half of the residents were not white. While the natural disasters themselves have not chosen who they affect, historical practices have led some of the most vulnerable populations being forced or encouraged to live in areas where the most damage is caused. However, this on its own has not caused the entirety of the disparities in natural disaster effects on vulnerable populations. There are several factors that may create disparities for people in vulnerable populations, such as minorities, the elderly, and low-income families, to prepare for a natural disaster, including lack of resources to prepare or evacuate, physical isolation, and language barriers. Many rural communities can have difficulties during natural disasters due to physical isolation, high poverty rates, and limited access to health care, as well as limited financial capacity. All of these factors make a major difference in the effects and preparation an individual and family has for a natural disaster. For example, those who are physically isolated often have a more difficult time getting messages and warnings about incoming natural disasters, making it more difficult for them to attempt to evacuate. Additionally, for those who cannot evacuate, it is significantly more difficult to get them help, worsening their chances of survival. High poverty rates and a limited financial capacity can make it extremely difficult for people to prepare for a disaster and evacuate, as they may not be able to take the financial toll of leaving their homes and finding other shelter for the duration of the disaster. This may have affected in part the decision for Houston officials to not order an evacuation prior to Hurricane Harvey in 2017. While the main consideration for not ordering an evacuation was related to the type of storm and issues attempting to evacuate Houston during Hurricane Rita in 2005, city officials also had to consider how some of the most vulnerable populations in the city, such as the poor, disabled, and elderly, would fare under a mandated evacuation. And the reality was, for some of them, it may not be possible to leave. Not only could the elderly and disabled have difficulties evacuating due to their financial stability, but many may also have medical needs that require them to receive special medications that they may not have, or they may rely on medical devices that need power, which they may not have readily available during the evacuations. Without additional resources, many of these vulnerable populations may not have a choice but to stay in their homes or care facilities during a natural disaster, despite the dangers that may come with them staying. Another factor that may impact a person's ability to prepare for a natural disaster is language barriers. For example, when Hurricane Helene hit in 2024, information for evacuation zone was sent out in English and Spanish. While this may seem like it would be enough, this excludes over 400,000 households in Florida, whose primary language is Haitian Creole, and tens of thousands more who have other primary languages within the household. While it may seem like this doesn't affect many people, when hundreds of thousands of people cannot access information that may be life-saving, this creates a level of inequality that is unjust, and it creates a potentially deadly level of negligence. While redlining and disparities in how vulnerable populations can prepare already show a large level of inequality, there is also some level of inequality shown in how the government and other organizations respond to natural disasters. Natural disaster response is often dictated by state and federal governments, but this response is often not completely equitable to those who have been affected by the disaster, due to overall disparities in fund allocation on the basis of race and socioeconomic status, lack of transparency for what is required of the aid seeker, and difficulty in completion of application for the aid seeker. A study from 2022 explored how FEMA's Disaster Recovery Assistance Fund was allocated. FEMA is the federal emergency management agency which works under the Department of Homeland Security and is responsible for supporting individuals and emergency services in improving their ability to prepare for, protect against, respond to, recover from, and mitigate all hazards. FEMA is best known for being responsible for the large-scale response to all natural disasters, including but not limited to hurricanes, tornadoes, wildfires, flooding, winter storms, etc. The 2022 study was done using data from the Open FEMA database and was aimed at analyzing how social vulnerability affected the disaster responses for vulnerable communities. The article defines social vulnerability as any factors that hinder their disaster preparedness, risk mitigation, and recovery capacity, and disproportionately increases disaster damage and loss burden. The factors used specifically include employment status, housing, population structure, race, socioeconomic status, and special needs. It was found that areas with higher percentages of Blacks, Hispanics, and Native Americans received less IHP and Repair Replace Assistance funds. One could argue that this is simply because these groups didn't have as much to lose as others and therefore require less compensation to replace it. However, another article from 2024 studied the systematic flaws in the aid application system that make it inaccessible for these groups to receive aid at all. This study broke its findings down into 5 large categories, which created recovery barriers. The recovery process is difficult to navigate, exclusion or lack of access to political power and processes, exclusion due to discrimination, issues in the funding aid ecosystem, and politics and the media play an inordinate role in recovery outcomes. All of these can create very large barriers for those who are not knowledgeable in the processes required for seeking aid or face discrimination due to their race and status. The first of these barriers to be discussed is the difficulty of the recovery process. Seeking aid after a natural disaster can be viewed as a very bureaucratic process. There are extensive paperwork and many agencies that individuals may have to go through before they receive any aid at all. This can be frustrating and deter aid seekers from going through the process. If the process is frustrating for the average person, vulnerable groups may not even be able to consider it due to the difficulties and time involved with it. Next, the study looked at how not having political power in the decision-making process could be a barrier for vulnerable groups to seek aid. The study found that this lack of decision-making power can lead to the creation of many more barriers, such as exclusion on the basis of language, lack of technology access, lack of transportation, the inability to fully participate in the recovery process due to other responsibilities, geographic isolation, cultural differences, and the capacity of local offices. When the people most impacted by the decisions are unable to take part in them, they often have to suffer the consequences, which in this case may impact a very large number of people, particularly those already in vulnerable groups, as they may have more difficulty accessing technology, reaching local offices, or finding the time to achieve and to be active in recovery processes while completing their other responsibilities such as childcare and work. The third major barrier revolved around discrimination solely based on race, economic status, and sexuality, which was mentioned by a previous study as well. While this study was a literature review looking at different papers and not raw data, it did find that those in lower socioeconomic classes faced more barriers for receiving aid due to low credit, unfair buyout programs, and the prioritization of homeowners over renters in aid distribution. Racial discrimination took the form of lower acceptance rates for small business loans, gentrification, and less recovery money granted, while sexuality was targeted by the government not recognizing same-sex couples and therefore restricting the amount of aid they could receive since they were not viewed as a family unit. There was also a level of deterrence solely due to the distrust some groups have in the government. When vulnerable groups are not treated historically well, it leads to long-term distrust, similar to what we still see today with Black communities not trusting police due to prior instances of brutality. In order to address this, there needs to be serious reforms made to how these communities are treated. The fourth of the major barriers covered by this article focus on the lack of organization within the government itself and how its processes work. The fifth of these barriers looked at the effects politicians and the media have on disaster response. It is clear that natural disaster response is not equal or equitable due to an abundance of factors. Not only are the shadows of historical discrimination still present in the areas affected by natural disasters, but present-day discrimination still impacts how we prevent and recover from these disasters. Natural disasters do not target people, but when vulnerable communities are left behind, we make them targets. It is imperative that we find a way to eliminate or at least reduce this inequality before more property, personal belongings, and lives are destroyed. The natural disasters would not end, but the devastation they cause could.